Escape from prison is a feat that requires a combination of cunning, resourcefulness, and bravery. Throughout history, there have been a number of prisoners who have managed to break free from their captors and make a dramatic escape. Here are the stories of 5 of the most famous prisoners who have pulled off a successful escape. These individuals have become legends in the criminal underworld for their daring and elaborate escapes, and their stories will be remembered for years to come. Henri Charrière. Henri Charrière, also known as Papillon, was a French criminal who became famous for his daring escape from the notorious Devil's Island penal colony in French Guiana. But before we get to that, let's back up a bit and find out how Henri ended up in prison in the first place. Henri was a small-time crook who had been in and out of jail for various petty crimes, but one day, he was accused of a murder he didn't commit and was sentenced to life in prison. Determined to prove his innocence, Henri vowed to escape and clear his name. As he sat in his cell, Henri must have felt a mix of anger and desperation. He knew he was innocent, but the legal system had failed him. He had no choice but to serve out his sentence and hope for a miracle. But Henri was not one to give up easily. He spent the next several years studying the layout of the prison and looking for weaknesses in the security system. He made connections with other prisoners and formed alliances, always keeping his ultimate goal in mind. Finally, Henri came up with a plan. He knew that the key to his escape was getting off the island itself. So, he set his sights on the dock, where a small boat was kept. Henri knew that the dock was heavily guarded, and that sneaking past the guards would be no easy feat, but he was determined to try. Over the course of several months, Henri carefully laid the groundwork for his escape. He studied the movements of the guards and looked for patterns in their behavior. He scouted out the best route to the dock, taking into account the location of the watchtowers and the blind spots. And most importantly, he acquired a homemade key that he had fashioned out of a spoon. This key would be the key to unlocking his cell door and setting him free. Finally, in 1933, Henri put his plan into action. Using the key, he unlocked his cell door and made his way out of the prison. With the help of a fellow prisoner, he snuck past the guards and made his way to the dock, where the small boat was waiting for them. The escape itself was a grueling and perilous journey. Henri and his accomplice had to navigate through rough seas and battle hunger and thirst as they made their way to the mainland. They were constantly on the lookout for pursuing authorities, and had to use all their cunning and resourcefulness to evade capture. But in the end, they succeeded. They made it to the mainland, where they went into hiding and eventually made their way to freedom. Henri's incredible escape from Devil's Island became the stuff of legend, and his story inspired a best-selling book and several film adaptations. And as for Henri's innocence, well, let's just say he had a knack for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But one thing's for sure, he was a master of the great escape. Frank Morris. Frank Morris was a career criminal who became famous for his daring escape from Alcatraz, one of the most secure prisons in the United States. But before we get to that, let's back up a bit and find out how Frank ended up in prison in the first place. Frank had a troubled childhood and turned to a life of crime at a young age. He was in and out of jail for various offenses, and eventually ended up at Alcatraz, the infamous federal penitentiary located on an island in the San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz was known as the inescapable prison, and for good reason. It was surrounded by icy cold water and guarded by armed guards and watchtowers. It seemed like there was no way out. But Frank was not one to be deterred by a challenge. He spent his time at Alcatraz studying the layout of the prison and looking for weaknesses in the security system. He made connections with other prisoners and formed alliances. Frank knew that the key to his escape was getting off the island itself. So, he set his sights on the shore, where he hoped to find a way to the mainland. Frank knew that the shore was heavily guarded and that sneaking past the guards would be no easy feat, but he was determined to try. He couldn't stand the thought of spending the rest of his life behind bars. Over the course of several months, Frank carefully laid the groundwork for his escape. He studied the movements of the guards and looked for patterns in their behavior. He scouted out the best route to the shore. Frank also spent countless hours practicing his swimming and paddling skills, knowing that he would need them to make it to the mainland. And most importantly, he acquired the tools and supplies he would need to make his escape. This included a small inflatable raft, which he hoped would carry him to safety. Frank and his accomplices, Clarence and John Anglin, spent months secretly constructing the raft in their cells, using supplies they had smuggled in or acquired through underground channels. They used a secret code to communicate with each other, and worked tirelessly to make sure every detail was perfect. Finally, on the night of June 11, 1962, Frank put his plan into action. He and his accomplices made their way out of their cells and onto the roof of the prison. As they made their way down the side of the building, they could feel the wind whipping through their hair and the cold water of the San Francisco Bay lapping at their feet. They knew that one wrong move could mean certain death. But they were determined to make it to freedom. They reached the ground and quickly made their way to the shore, where they had stashed their raft and supplies. The escape itself was a grueling and perilous journey. Frank and his accomplices had to navigate through rough seas and battle hunger and thirst as they made their way to the mainland. They were constantly on the lookout for pursuing authorities, and had to use all their cunning and resourcefulness to evade capture. At times, Frank and his accomplices felt like they might not make it. The water was so cold that their fingers were numb, and they had to paddle for hours to stay warm. They were also plagued by hunger and thirst, as they had no food or water with them. But they refused to give up. They knew that freedom was within reach, and they were willing to risk everything to get it. As they neared the shore, they could see the lights of the city twinkling in the distance. They knew they were getting closer. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they made it to the mainland. They dragged their raft onto the shore and collapsed onto the ground, exhausted but exhilarated. Frank Morris's escape from Alcatraz became the stuff of legend, and his story also inspired a best-selling book and several film adaptations. To this day, the fate of Frank Morris and his accomplices remains a mystery. Some believe that they drowned in the icy waters of the San Francisco Bay, while others believe that they made it to the mainland and started new lives under new identities. Vladimir Remek. Vladimir Remek was a Czechoslovakian politician and dissident who became famous for his daring escape from a Soviet labor camp in the 1970s. But before we get to that, let's back up a bit and find out more about Vladimir's life before his imprisonment. Vladimir was born in 1950 in the city of Plzeň, Czechoslovakia. He grew up during a time of great political turmoil in his country, as it was under the control of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party. As a young man, Vladimir was ambitious and idealistic. He believed in the principles of socialism and was eager to make a difference in the world. He joined the Communist Party and rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a member of the Central Committee. But as Vladimir grew older, he began to question the Soviet Union's influence in Czechoslovakia. He saw firsthand the corruption and repression that existed within the party, and he became a vocal critic of Soviet interference in his country. This made Vladimir a target of the authorities, and in 1977, he was arrested and charged with espionage and treason. He was subjected to a show trial and was found guilty, despite a lack of evidence against him. Vladimir was sentenced to life in prison and was sent to a labor camp in the Soviet Union, where he was forced to work long hours in harsh conditions. He was isolated from the outside world and cut off from his family and friends. But Vladimir refused to give up. He knew that he was innocent and that he had been unfairly imprisoned. He was determined to escape and clear his name. Over the course of several years, Vladimir carefully planned his escape. Vladimir knew that the key to his escape was getting past the guards and making it to the nearby woods. From there, he hoped to find a way to the border and make his way back to Czechoslovakia. Vladimir also acquired the tools and supplies he would need to make his escape. This included a map of the surrounding area, a compass, and a small supply of food and water. He knew that he would have to rely on his wits and resourcefulness to survive in the wilderness. Finally, on the night of October 23, 1979, Vladimir put his plan into action. He waited until the guards were distracted, and then made his move. He slipped out of his cell and made his way to the perimeter fence, using all his stealth and cunning to avoid detection. As he approached the fence, Vladimir could feel his heart racing. He knew that if he was caught, he would be punished severely, but he also knew that this was his only chance at freedom. With a burst of adrenaline, Vladimir climbed over the fence and dropped to the ground on the other side. He was free. Vladimir knew that he had to act fast. He had to get as far away from the camp as possible before the guards realized he was missing. He ran through the woods, following his map and compass, and heading for the border. The escape itself was a grueling and perilous journey. Vladimir had to navigate through rough terrain and battle hunger and thirst as he made his way to freedom. He was constantly on the lookout for pursuing authorities, and had to use all his cunning and resourcefulness to evade capture. At times, Vladimir felt like he might not make it. The woods were dark and treacherous, and he had to navigate through rough terrain and harsh weather. He was also plagued by hunger and thirst, as he had only a small supply of food and water. But Vladimir refused to give up. He knew that freedom was within reach, and he was willing to risk everything to get it. As he neared the border, Vladimir could see the lights of the city twinkling in the distance. He knew he was getting closer. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Vladimir made it to the border. He crossed into Czechoslovakia and collapsed onto the ground, exhausted. To this day, Vladimir is remembered as a hero in Czechoslovakia and a symbol of resistance against Soviet oppression. His determination and resourcefulness made him a legend in the annals of political history. Vladimir Remek, one of the most famous prisoners to ever escape from a Soviet labor camp. His bravery and determination will never be forgotten. El Chapo. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was a notorious Mexican drug lord who became famous for his daring escapes from prison. But before we get to that, let's back up a bit and find out more about El Chapo's life before his imprisonment. Joaquin Guzman was born in 1954 in the small town of La Tuna, Mexico. He grew up in poverty and turned to a life of crime at a young age. He quickly rose through the ranks of the drug trade and became one of the most powerful and feared drug lords in Mexico. El Chapo was known for his ruthless tactics and his ability to evade capture. He was a master of disguise and had a network of allies and associates who helped him operate his criminal enterprise. El Chapo's criminal empire spanned across the globe, and his organization, the Sinaloa Cartel, was responsible for a significant portion of the drug trafficking in the United States. But in 1993, El Chapo was finally arrested and sentenced to prison. He was sent to a high-security facility in Mexico, where he was held in solitary confinement. El Chapo spent the next several years in prison, but he never gave up on the idea of escape. In 2001, he began working on a plan to break out. El Chapo's escape was a carefully orchestrated affair. He enlisted the help of several accomplices, including a group of corrupt prison guards and maintenance workers. He also bribed officials in the prison and in the local police to turn a blind eye to his escape. On the night of January 19, 2001, El Chapo put his plan into action. He waited until the guards were distracted, and then made his move. Francisco El Chito Camberos Rivera, a prison guard, opened El Chapo's electronically operated cell door, and El Chapo got into a laundry cart that maintenance worker Javier Camberos rolled through several doors and eventually out the front door. El Chapo was then transported in the trunk of a car driven by Camberos out of the town. At a petrol station, Camberos went inside, but when he came back, El Chapo was gone on foot into the night. El Chapo's escape was a masterful feat of deception and planning. He had carefully cultivated a network of accomplices within the prison and had bribed officials in the local police to ensure that he had at least 24 hours to get out of the state and stay ahead of the military manhunt. The escape allegedly cost El Chapo $2.5 million, but it was worth every penny as he managed to evade capture for years. But even in prison, El Chapo was not content to stay put. He continued to run his criminal enterprise from behind bars, using his network of allies and associates to keep the Sinaloa cartel thriving. In 2015, El Chapo made headlines again when he escaped from a Mexican prison for a second time, using a tunnel dug under his cell. This time, however, he was not so lucky. He was recaptured just a few months later and is now serving a life sentence in a U.S. prison. El Chapo's escapes will go down in history as some of the most daring and elaborate in the annals of crime. He was a master of deception and a true criminal mastermind, and his legacy will live on for years to come. Pascal Payet. Pascal Payet is a notorious French criminal who is known for his multiple escapes from prison. Born in 1963 in Montpellier, France, Payet spent his childhood in Lyon before settling in Marseille. In 1988, he was convicted of aggravated assault and again in 1993 for conspiracy. On November 20, 1997, Payet participated in an attack on a Banque de France armored car in Salon province during which a guard was killed. He was arrested along with Eric Alborio in Paris in January 1999 and sentenced to prison. In 2001, Payet escaped from a prison in the village of Luynes in the French department of Bouches-du-Rhône on board a hijacked helicopter with Frederic Mpaco. On October 18, Mpaco was captured and brought in for questioning in Paris. In 2003, Payet organized another helicopter escape from the Luynes prison, this time of Frank Perletto, Michel Valero, and Eric Alborio, who had been arrested with him in 1999. They were caught 3 weeks later. In 2005, Payet was sentenced to 30 years in prison for murder in connection with the 1997 armored car hijacking in Salon province. This sentence was upheld in 2006 following an appeal. In 2007, he confessed to organizing the 2003 escape and was sentenced to an additional 7 years in prison, while his co-conspirators were each sentenced to 3. He was also sentenced to another 6 years for his own escape in 2001. Despite being classified as a détenu particulièrement surveillé, or a prisoner under especially high surveillance, and being kept in solitary confinement, Payet managed to escape once again in 2007. On Bastille Day, four masked men hijacked a helicopter from Cannes Airport and used it to free Payet from his solitary confinement in a prison in Grasse. The helicopter landed in Brignoles, France, on the Mediterranean coast, and Payet and his accomplices fled the scene. The pilot was released unharmed. Despite being imprisoned in a secret location for security reasons, Payet was not done making headlines. In 2011, he was sentenced to an additional 5 years in prison for his 2007 escape. His 3 accomplices were also sentenced to prison terms. Payet's escapes have made him a legend in the criminal world, and he is considered one of the most dangerous and notorious criminals in France. His Hollywood-style helicopter jailbreaks have been the subject of numerous TV shows and articles, and he holds the record for planning the most number of escapes by helicopter. Payet is currently serving his prison sentence in France, and it is unlikely that he will be released anytime soon, but his legacy as a master of escape will live on for years to come. And so concludes the stories of some of the most famous escape artists in history. These individuals have become legends in a criminal world for their bravery, resourcefulness, and cunning in breaking free from their captors. We hope you enjoyed learning about their incredible escapes and the lessons we can learn from them. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like these. Thank you for watching.